Good morning, West Coast. Good afternoon, East Coast. Thank you for joining us for today's CITI program webinar. Today's topic is Transitioning Research to the Revised Common Rule, the what, how, and why, and it will be presented by Karen Christianson. This webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be available on the CITI program website. Now let me tell you about today's presenter, Karen Christianson. Ms. Christianson is the Associate Vice President at the HRP Consulting Group. Ms. Christianson's passion for research was ignited by her experience as a pregnant subject in a clinical trial. Following this experience, Ms. Christianson became a research nurse at a large academic medical center and spent a number of years managing a broad portfolio of investigator-initiated, industry, and NIH-supported research. Ms. Christianson eventually transitioned into a role in academic affairs and was responsible for establishing a human research quality assurance improvement program, training, and ongoing education programs, and building the foundation for a comprehensive human research protection program, of which she was named director. Ms. Christianson led the program through a successful application for AHRP accreditation in 2010 and was subsequently invited to become an AHRP site visitor. Her dedication to best practices in research was honored at the 2011 Primer AER conference when she was presented with IRB-Net's Ethics and Human Subject Protection Award. Ms. Christianson joined HRP Consulting Group in 2013 and has since successfully partnered with a number of clients to evaluate, improve, and support their HRPP, IRB, and research integrity functions. Her specialties include program evaluation and enhancement, process evaluation and enhancement, accreditation support, policy development, training, and management and compliance issues.
Our learning objectives today, by the end of this presentation, we hope that you'll be able to describe the applicability of the pre-2018 and 2018 versions of the Common Rule, describe the factors an organization may want to consider when deciding whether to transition a pre-existing study or studies to comply with the revised rule, and to discuss strategies for the management and communication of transition decisions. This presentation does not address broad consent or the related Category 7 and 8 exemptions, as that would be too much to cover in the time we have available. Some terminology. This is just some terms that you might hear me use throughout this presentation. Pre-existing research or pre-existing study refers to ongoing research that was initially IRB approved, including approved with conditions or determined exempt before January 21st, 2019. The pre-2018 requirements or pre-2018 Common Rule refers to the version of the Common Rule that immediately preceded the revisions that generally went into effect on January 21st of 2019. The 2018 requirements, or the revised rule, refers to the current version of the Common Rule that generally went into effect on January 21st. And the transition date refers to the date that an institution determines and the institution or IRB documents that a study initiated before January 21st will comply with the 2018 requirements instead of the pre-2018 requirements. So before we jump in too far, let's quickly run through some of the changes in the revised rule that might impact the decision whether to transition a study. This isn't all encompassing, just the highlights of those parts of the rule that might impact the research or the decision making regarding transitioning. The exempted categories have undergone significant changes, with some being brand new, some broadened, new contingencies added, the limited IRB review requirement for certain categories in certain circumstances, and the allowance for applying exemptions to research that only incidentally includes prisoners. The definition of research has changed, and certain activities are now specifically deemed to not be research. Continuing review has been eliminated for certain research. The general requirements for consent have changed, and there are new elements of consent. There's a new requirement for posting of clinical trial consent forms. There's new criteria and restrictions for waivers of consent. There's a new allowance for waiver of documentation of consent for distinct cultural groups or communities in which signing forms is not the norm. Reliance agreements or procedures must now address the division of responsibilities between the relying organization and the reviewing IRB to ensure compliance. And still pending is the now required re-examination of the concept of identifiability, both the relevant definitions and the techniques that might render information identifiable, and the revision of the expedited categories. So let's talk a little bit about non-exempt research and, an approach to how to consider transition of such studies. So I would suggest that you begin by thinking about what remains essentially unchanged under the revised rule. For this, you may want to validate that the criteria remain satisfied, much like you do with continuing review, particularly if changes are going to be made to the research or are proposed to the research at the same time. You want to think about what changes from the revised rule are applicable to the research and whether revisions are needed to the research in order for the research to comply. And this is where I would argue you should focus your review. And you need to remember and keep in mind the documentation of the institutional determination to transition the research, what that's going to look like, what the timing of that's going to be.
The first question we have is, shouldn't the institution of the IRB of record for a multi-site study be able to make the transition decision for a study?
Well, that would certainly make sense, but unfortunately it's not the way the regulation is written, and I have specifically reached out to OHRP to confirm this. I would advocate that the institution of the IRB of record should take the lead in approaching the discussion with the other relying organizations to attempt to come to consensus before any organization documents a decision to transition. Because in that case, you're going to be behind the 8 ball and, scrambling to pull things together and make sure that you're being as consistent as possible.
We encourage you to monitor the CITI program website for additional information about future webinars this year.